In the name of the one who loves the beloved and love itself. Amen. I don't know what you want when we gather in the middle of the night for a service at the end of this difficult year, but I want candlelight and poetry. That's what I need. We have plenty of candlelight around us, and I've lit an extra candle here for you. And the opening to John's Gospel provides all the poetry we need. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's a wonderful, wonderful passage full of meaning and depth. There's a wonderful line in it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's a wonderful line, but different poets have had different ways of interpreting it. There's a Greek word in the middle of that line, katalaben, which has been interpreted overcome. Translated that way in a New Revised Standard Version of the Bible that we use here all the time. And I love the modern words of our translation. But sometimes I do like the poetry of the King James. In that line in the King James, it says, "The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not." The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. That word katalaben has many possible meanings. It could mean overcome, or it could mean grasped. It could mean it just doesn't understand. The idea of the light and the darkness being in conflict and the darkness not being able to overcome the light makes it feel a little bit like an episode of Star Wars or The Mandalorian that I've been enjoying recently. Light versus darkness, a big battle, the power of each, which one's going to win? I actually like the subtlety of the alternative translation. Not that there's this battle of wills or powers, but that there's something about understanding going on in the heart of this gospel and going on in our Christmas celebrations. It's not that the light cannot be overcome by the darkness, it's that the darkness just doesn't get the light. Just doesn't understand what's going on. I like going for my walks, as you know, and I went for a walk this evening. I took River, my now 1-year-old Australian Shepherd mix, and we walked towards the Capitol building. As you walk up to the Capitol building, you can see the light of the Capitol dome shining over Sacramento. I walked up to it and I walked around to the left-hand side of the Capitol, looked up, and the lights were still shining. I could see it through the tree branches, and it was lovely. I kept on walking around a little further, and I got to the far side of the Capitol building, turned around, and for the first time I saw the tree lights lit. They've been there all through December, but I normally go out early in the morning when they're not turned on. So in the middle of the night, I could see that light shining in the darkness. That thing that we do in December, lighting lights against the darkness of the month as the days close in. I posed River for the selfie, obviously. She didn't really want to. She gave me side eye. She really didn't want to be in the photo, but I made it happen. I'll share it. I think I shared it already on Instagram if you want to find it. And then walked on to the other side, the fourth side of the Capitol. And something stopped me and took my breath away. If you look on that side of the Capitol, there's the great edifice of the building itself, the symbol of power in California, political power and dominance, a place where Political forces are wrought and people fight over legislation and try and win their arguments. And then at the base of the Capitol building, very, very small, but brightly lit, there was a creche, like the one that we blessed tonight. The thing that really took my breath away was just the contrast between the massive Capitol building and the tiny creche. I took a photograph of it, but because of the security barriers, I couldn't get very close. It was very distant. I could make out Mary and Joseph and the baby, and it just made me wonder for a moment. Why would God want to do this? Look at it, the contrast of the power of the Capitol versus this tiny baby in a manger. The contrast of power and vulnerability was right there in front of me. And it made me think of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything that came into being came through him. And that was the Word that became flesh, the infant child in the manger. John's Gospel goes out of its way to make sure that we understand that God is that which brings the universe into being. I just didn't get why such a powerful entity would want to rely on Mary and Joseph to look after him, would become so vulnerable, so fragile as to be an infant. Why would God choose to do that? Why would he choose to have Mary and Joseph change his diapers, feed him, care for him? Why would he trust them not to drop him, not to leave him behind? They did leave him behind at one point in his childhood. Why would God trust them to do that? Made me continue to think about the life of Jesus and that reading from John. He came to his own, and his own rejected him. The two things we know about Jesus really strongly, actually we know lots of things about Jesus because I'm sure you've all listened to all the sermons, but the two main things we know are that he came at Christmas as an infant and that he died on a cross, being rejected by his people. Rejected because he challenged them to love one another in a fresh way, and they could not cope with his challenge, so they wanted to destroy him. The two main things we know about Jesus are that he occupied a place of immense vulnerability, an infant who needed to be cared for, and someone who was killed on a cross alongside criminals. I just don't understand that. Makes me realize that I get wedded to the concept of power. I'm a part of the systems that we occupy here in California, in our nation, in our world. Maybe there's some darkness in me that doesn't get the light of Christ, because I'm not sure I'd want to be that vulnerable if I started out that powerful. This makes me wonder what it is about the light that the darkness doesn't understand. I don't really think that the darkness is incapable of overcoming the light. I mean, I can easily blow the candle out. It's so fragile. It's so fragile. Like the Christ child. Like the man on the cross. And yet somehow its vulnerability is also its strength. It's easy to take another light and pass on the spark. Maybe not so easy. What I've noticed is that when I connect with my own vulnerability, I find my heart growing, and I find myself capable of connecting with the vulnerability of others. When I connect with my own vulnerability, I find myself able to empathize more. I find myself judging less. When I connect with my own vulnerability, I realize that we're all vulnerable. And we can create community around the fact that we want to care for each other and we understand each other's frailties. When I'm holding on to power, it's hard to make space for others in my life. There's something that the darkness doesn't understand, which is that the vulnerability of Christ as an infant, Christ as the crucified man, the vulnerability of God becoming human. It's all about God wanting to connect with us and inviting us to find ways to connect with each other and share our light, become sparks for each other, inspire one another, care for one another, particularly when we're struggling. I don't know about you, but I feel vulnerable at the end of this year in particular. I'm not sure vulnerable is quite the word. I feel like a raw nerve sometimes. I feel like this year has stretched us all so much, has been too much to cope with. And we could choose to react to each other with anger and aggression, snap at each other, break down. Or we could open ourselves up to the possibility that in this moment of vulnerability, we might actually be in a place where God's Spirit could blow over all of us and do some kind of remarkable work. Now, I also want to acknowledge that even though I feel vulnerable at the end of this year of COVID, I'm not that vulnerable. I'm doing okay. There are people who have suffered worse through this pandemic than you. There are people who have lost lives, livelihoods, loved ones. There are people who will not be with their loved ones tomorrow because of this pandemic. And I've not experienced that. But perhaps if I'm honest about how vulnerable I feel, my capacity to understand what others are going through might grow. I might be more amenable, more capable of hearing someone's pain. Not confronting their vulnerability with my power to save them, no. Stopping long enough because I'm feeling fragile to hear their fragility and learn from them. And like I say, perhaps at the end of this very difficult year, we might all be in a place to really understand what the vulnerability of the Christ child was about. We might be able to turn our back on the darkness that's in all of us, the clutching for power, the participation in systems that subjugate others. Perhaps we can turn our backs on those things and recognize that the darkness just doesn't understand the light. That the gift of the light is its fragility. And that when shared, our fragility can become the kind of light inspired by Christ that cannot be extinguished. The light shined in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have beheld his glory. Amen.